All right, welcome back to another edition of Accounting Research and Communication. We're going to jump ahead into Logic Chapter 2, starting with 2.1, talking about fallacies in general. And what I want to do is I'm going to do a little bit of back and forth here as we kind of go through this to kind of remind ourselves, all these different terms that we've been seeing here. So first, I want to talk about what is a good argument. A good argument is an argument that is sound or cogent. Sound is for deductive arguments and cogent is for inductive arguments. The idea behind soundness and cogency is that all the premises are true and the conclusion follows from the premises. To be a good argument, you need both 1 and 2. That's important, as we'll talk about later when we talk about bad arguments. Bad arguments, aka defective arguments. These are the arguments. If it's a deductive argument, it is unsound. If it's an inductive argument, it is uncogent. One or more of the premises are false, or the argument commits a fallacy, does not follow from the conclusion does not follow from the premises. So fallacies we'll talk about more specifically, but you've seen this topic before, the idea that, oh, for some reason, the conclusion just doesn't really seem to follow the logic inferred by the premises. So we'll talk about different ways that kind of messes with your mind. For a bad argument, you need either 1 or 2. You don't need both. You can have both 1 and 2, but remember that false premises is not the same thing as a fallacious argument. Those are two separate things. So fallacies, we'll talk about two different types here. The first one's going to be the formal fallacy. And this one's pretty specific to just one type of argument that we've seen before. But this is formal in the sense that there's a problem with the form or the structure of the argument. An argument is invalid if the arrangement of the terms of the statements are messed up in some kind of a way. We've seen this before with deductive arguments, so this really only applies to deductive arguments. Deductive arguments can be valid or invalid. So when we're talking about a formal fallacy, we're talking about validity or some type of issue with validity. Specifically, an argument that's deductive that is invalid is one that has a formal fallacy. It's not going to be anything else. That's why I kind of drew those boxes down below to help you kind of keep that in mind. Therefore, because it is a formal fallacy is an invalid deductive argument, what we can say is we're committing a formal fallacy only for deductive arguments. Is there other types of fallacies for inductive? Yes, there are. But when we're just talking about form, the idea behind the deductive argument is it has a pretty stringent qualification to become valid. Recall that a valid deductive argument is one where it is impossible for the conclusion to be false given true premises. Well, that's a pretty high hurdle. So in the case of a formal problem, we're really going to focus on the deductive side because inductive arguments, they tend to be a little bit more kind of sort of, well, mostly, right, leaves room open for error basically, but not deductive arguments. They're very straightforward. Appeals to rational inference. So when we're reading through a lot of these different types of arguments, we can see that deductive arguments tend to be pretty straightforward. And it's either pretty clear that the conclusion follows from the premises or it doesn't. We can make an invalid argument valid. That is to say, if a deductive argument is suffering from a formal fallacy, it's possible for us to rearrange some of the terms to make it valid. When we're looking at formal fallacies, I just want to kind of go over some of the structures that you tend to see. So in hypothetical syllogisms in general are basically saying like A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C kind of a thing. Hypothetical says if A, then B, A, thus B, things like that. So let's talk about just hypothetical syllogisms, just review it from the standpoint of just two terms. If A exists, then B exists. A exists, thus B exists. So this is a type of syllogism from a deductive standpoint, a deductive argument that is specifically a hypothetical syllogism. Is this valid or invalid? Well, in this case, we would say it is valid. There's no formal fallacy. It's impossible for the conclusion to be false. If A exists, then B exists. Hey, A exists, therefore B does. It is impossible for the conclusion to be false. That's the idea behind validity. Keep that in mind. But when we try to switch the terms here, if we say, for instance, if A exists, then B exists, like we said up above, but we say, well, B does exist, thus A exists. It's kind of going backwards. We can't really say that, so it's not valid. It's invalid. There is a formal fallacy. It is possible for C to be false. Here's what I mean by that. B could exist without A existing. So just because you see B out there doesn't mean, well, A is out there. We know that if A exists, then B will definitely exist. But B can be out there because, I don't know, maybe because of C or D or whatever, something else. That's the idea behind this, is when you're thinking about constructing an argument or even just a regular paragraph, you have to kind of test yourself and say, am I really considering all the alternatives here? So when we're looking at hypothetical syllogisms where there are three terms, this is one we tend to see more often, but you can have hypothetical syllogisms with just two, but in this case, we've seen this kind of before. If A exists, then B exists. Well, if B exists, then C exists. Well, therefore, if A exists, then C exists. So that's a classic valid argument there. It is impossible for the C to be false. This is one of those situations where we can say, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Similar type of situation, right? What if we say, if B exists, then C exists? If A exists, then B exists. Thus, if A, then C. Is that also a valid argument? It is. I'm kind of throwing that in there just to let you know that you can sort of switch the two premises, but generally speaking, you kind of want to like follow like a visual argument, like in sequential order, just kind of keep things straight in your mind. But the reality here is it's the same structure as you see up above. It's still valid. They just present the premises differently sometimes. It's impossible for the conclusion to be false. Don't be fooled by the order of the premises. Sometimes you see them in different orders. I've seen them in your textbook when they're talking about situations where you have valid or invalid arguments, sound or unsound arguments. Sometimes they switch the premises where it's kind of hard to follow. So if you ever come across a challenging argument, try just switching the order of the premises to see if it kind of makes sense. That's always a technique that I like to employ. If there's three terms, so if A exists, then B exists. If C exists, then B exists. So now, here's the situation where you're going to run into an invalidity. It has a formal fallacy. It's an invalid argument because it's possible for C to be false. It's possible for the conclusion to be false. In this case, what we're saying is, just because A exists doesn't mean that C will exist. A and C could possibly exist independently. That's the key feature about this. So you kind of see these sort of patterns written over and over again. And I think what I did was I kind of gave you, for deductive argument summary, this is from your textbook, where they're kind of, and I've rearranged the order of some of these premises here, but in the case where you have the conclusion does not follow from the premises, it really doesn't matter the truth or falsity of the premises or the conclusion. If the premises do not, if the conclusion does not follow from the premises, it really doesn't matter about the truth value of the individual statement. So, all roses are flowers, all daisies are flowers. Therefore, all daisies are roses. No, that's incorrect. This is like what you just saw in the previous slide here. If A, then B. If C, then B. Thus A and C. That's kind of what they're trying to show you here. Now, when you get past all that, when you actually get into a situation where there is a logical flow. So tigers are flowers, flowers are dogs, therefore tigers are dogs. Okay, well that's kind of what we saw in the previous example on the previous slide here. If A then B, if B then C, A then C. That works, but the problem with this is even though it's valid, these are really weird statements. They're false, okay? But we can have situations where the conclusion is at least true. But if you got false premises, the most you can say is a valid argument, but it's still unsound. The way you want to go, the thing you're trying to target for, is the true premises and a logical follow from the premises to the conclusion. All daisies are flowers are plants, daisies are plants. Fair enough. And those are all true premises. So we can say that's a sound argument. Again, this is just a summary to have that available in case you need it. When we're moving from the formal to the informal, we're kind of opening up the door a little bit here to all the different types of informal fallacies. And there's a lot of them here in the textbook. The idea behind formal fallacies is there's a problem with the content. Something just doesn't make sense. Okay, if we're getting past all the A, B, C, right? A equals B, whatever. Once we get past all that stuff, if we know we're kind of in like a maybe it sounds valid, potentially it is valid the way it's structured, but the actual content itself just doesn't make sense somehow. We're struggling with that. Okay, that is where it requires us to have like some knowledge about the key content, right? We can look at something and say that doesn't seem right somehow, but why? It occurs in deductive and inductive arguments. So we're going to look at a broad swath here. And the idea here, keep in mind, is you're trying to train your mind on how to think and read critically. That's the whole goal behind this. The idea behind informal fallacies is trying to appeal to the listener's disposition or prejudices, and there's multiple types there. So you often don't even know you're being fooled when these informal fallacies come into play. So informal fallacies of relevance. So here's like one chunk of the different types of informal fallacies. Where the premises, the idea behind the relevance, informal fallacies of relevance is that the premises seem logically irrelevant to the conclusion. Like there's a disconnect. I don't get it, right? Why did you have either the premises don't make sense or the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises? That tends to be the one where we can sort of sense it. The premises appear to be relevant, maybe psychologically. They're built that way because someone's trying to get you to make the conclusion seem like it follows from the premises, right? But they're just fooling you somehow. The idea here is that we need to distinguish genuine evidence from emotional appeal. Oftentimes, any type of advertisement, any type of political speech is going to appeal to your emotions. The genuine evidence rarely kind of comes into play, and even if it does, it's talked about in a very disingenuous kind of fashion. So let's talk about some of these issues with relevance. Okay, the first one is force, or an appeal to force. The idea behind appeal to force is to scare or intimidate somebody into accepting your conclusion, either physical harm or psychological harm. For example, people who don't get bonuses, don't get the bonuses that they deserve, become unproductive. I deserve a bonus. I will become unproductive if I don't get the bonus I deserve. Right? There's a hidden kind of threat here, but the key thing to realize is it must be directed at the person who is in charge, somebody who has the ability to actually award a bonus there. Otherwise, it's not a threat. It's just like people just, blowing steam or something like that. But the ideal here is if it's an argument, it's meant to force action on somebody's part. Here, we're trying to force a manager to actually give us something because we're intimidating them with, hey, I'm going to be less productive, which is going to hurt you and your numbers overall. An appeal to pity provokes pity of the listener. Oh, the poor economy has caused financial struggles. To accept a bonus would be selfish. We should all sacrifice to help others make ends meet. You should refuse to accept the bonus. Well, here's the thing about that. You may kind of look at that and say, hey, maybe I am being selfish because assuming that the bonus criteria has been met sort of seems irrelevant about what the economy is doing or how other people are doing. That seems kind of harsh to say that, but realize that some people may appeal to pity in different ways. You don't even really know it. It can be just very subtle, but appeals to pity happen a lot. Another one is the appeal to the people. This one sounds kind of weird. There's a bunch of different ways that this happens, but by and large, this is the appeal that actually happens most often. And the reason why it happens the most is because there's different ways that it happens. And you usually see it in like advertisements, especially. How do you arouse a crowd or just a listener directly through excitement, enthusiasm, fear, aka fear mongering, using terrorism as like a key trigger word, right? We all have to protect ourselves against terrorism, don't we? Another one being bandwagon argument. Hey, I'm going to say something because I want to fit in with everybody else. It's not necessarily my argument. It's just a way to sort of get everyone to kind of agree with me. Vanity, love, admiration, approval, using celebrities, especially in advertisements. Snobbery, appeal to the elite, the rich, powerful, etc. You here matter more than those people over there. Right? This idea that, somehow I'm going to be convinced about what you say simply because I'm better than some other crowd. Right? Maybe I'm Republican and other people are Democrat or vice versa. The ideal here is to say that someone's going to try to convince you of something because you're clearly a person who gets it. Right? Tradition is a big one. We've always done it this way. This is the one that drives me nuts most of all as well. That's just the way we've been doing it. This gets people and companies especially into a lot of trouble. And especially when it comes to accounting rules. One of the reasons why we update the FASB updates accounting rules is because, hey, the landscape of business changes. We can't simply rely on the old revenue recognition criteria. We have to update them because there are new contracts out there that require companies to reconsider whether the timing and the amount, the timing, nature, timing, the amount, and the nature of the revenue to be recognized. So tradition is kind of one of those things where we say, it may be a starting point for us, but we really are always looking to be better. Against the person. This is kind of weird. The other one was for the people, appeal to the people. This one is against the person. Rebut someone else's argument, but not directly. Uses unrelated evidence to distract others. There's three different types here. Ad hominem abusive means that the arguer is going to go against a person's identity, their background, their traits, right? Are they an illegal citizen? Do they have a legitimate birth certificate? Whatever. By the way, the word ad hominem, it's Latin, it means against the person, not their position. So this is simply an attack on a person's character when we're talking about abusive. We can also say there's circumstantial ad hominems, one where we're kind of going after, a person's motives. Do they have a hidden agenda? Do they have a vested interest? The colloquy is a hypocrisy of the person's words versus actions. Their actions don't match their words. It's a contradiction, right? If I want to go after somebody, can say that, oh, hey, this person says that they'll bring home the troops, but they never do, right? Or this person says that they're going to fix inflation, but they never have, right? Or they say they really care about the soldiers, the fallen soldiers, but they make comments they call them about them being losers or something like that, right? So all these things are essentially attacks against a person, not the position. And this one we see, this is essentially mudslinging, if you were to call it that. Now, the fifth one is accident, using the role of a broad appeal or broad acceptance. This one you tend to see a lot justified in the workplace. So companies take a certain policy, accounting policy and position, because why? Because their competitors are doing it, right? Don't reinvent the wheel. Pull down the 10K, read through the notes, and figure out how someone else is, recognizing revenue or write-offs. The idea here is to apply the rule to unrelated circumstances. This is where it gets into the problem here, is that you can't just simply say, oh, I'm going to take something that everyone accepts to be true. Oh, we need to be conservative in our accounting estimates, right? Not necessarily, because it deliberately ignores exceptions. First of all, being conservative is a violation of neutrality. But even if someone were to come out and say that, oh, hey, we need to, when in doubt, disclose. Not necessarily. It sounds like we should, right? We want to be transparent, don't we? Things like that. We have to be very careful about taking sort of broad rules and applying them to specific situations, because we find ourselves like missing out on the special rules that tell us not to do things. So as an example, the ambulance was speeding. Speeding is against the law. The driver of the ambulance should get a speeding ticket. Well, if an ambulance is speeding, get the heck out of its way, right? Just because it's speeding, yeah, it may be against the law, but they get a pass because there's certain exceptions to that rule. Constitutional law prohibits discrimination based on gender. Only women or females have one employee of the month at my workplace. A man or male should win the next employee of the month. Yeah, well, you can say that there is discrimination in the workplace, but that's not necessarily what's going on in a situation where someone may have earned Employee of the Month or earned an award, right? You can't just sort of take a broad rule and say, oh, you're violating my X number amendment rights, so therefore I need to be vindicated somehow. That doesn't work in that case. It just so happens there's all kinds of exceptions to the rules. The straw man fallacy. Distorting the opposing argument to make it easier to rebut. The arguer's position becomes stronger in the straw man. So think about this is a classic. Some people call this slippery slope. It's not. The straw man is basically manipulating you into siding for one thing over the other. Budget critics want money allocated for the military from the military to education. So my critics want me to allocate more money to education, pull that from the military. But we can't protect our well-educated children without a strong military. A well-funded military prevents terrorists from winning. This is a classic case here where you're just saying, like, oh, you manipulated me. You got me down this path. Or you just kind of like, the idea here is we need more money for education. Fine. Where's it going to come from? Probably the military. Hold on, right? Are you basically saying that you're basically saying it's okay for the terrorists to win? No, I'm not saying that. Ridiculous. Another one to look out for is the missing the point, ignores logical inferences. This is where you can really, sometimes when you hear people, you're like thinking, I don't think you're getting it, or you're kind of missing the point entirely. It's not a claim against it's not a claim that they're stupid. They may be deliberately seeing a different perspective on a situation, and you owe it to be open-minded, but ask them to be very clear about you know how where they're coming from and whether or not they're acknowledging your perspective too. So sometimes missing the point is really just when you're talking with somebody, it's different perspectives, and those kind of perspectives, the differences need to be acknowledged on this. So ignores logical inferences from the premises, puts forth differing conclusion, irrelevant to the opposition's purpose. So these are kind of tongue in cheek. Why should I go to the library to study? I already have the books. I don't need any more books. Right? Well, you go to the library to study. You don't go to the library to get books and study. You just go to the library to study. Walmart is forcing me to wear a mask and social distance. Such mandates are a violation of my constitutional rights. Like, well, the point is, if you don't wear a mask and you don't social distance, you might get a fatal disease and die. So what's the point of having constitutional rights? What does constitutional rights have anything to do with being alive? Right? Let's look at the bigger picture here. To live in peace and harmony means having enough nuclear weapons to blow up the world 10 times over. Hey, guess what? If there's a nuclear war, the whole world is going to die. Okay, so it doesn't really matter. The idea behind nuclear deterrence, right, or mutually assured destruction, that makes more sense to sort of ensure the peace, but it's really more of a Cold War mentality even then. So it's kind of weird. You look at this and say, I don't think that is what is intended by having nuclear weapons. Let's see here. So red herring. This is one you may hear all the time. The idea here is to change the subject or the subject matter. It's classic misdirection. Red herring. It's total distraction, diversion. The premises become irrelevant. So Jones's proposal calls for a 10% reduction in student tuition. Doing so saves money and increases operational efficiency. Great. But Jones was born in a different country, and we shouldn't let foreigners dictate university policy, right? It's like, whoa, wait a minute here. If we go for something that, hey, that's good, to you bringing in this weird sort of premise to destroy the whole point of what's going on. Red herrings are pretty common. You see that in a lot of places. You got to watch out for them. Be able to call people out on their bullshit when they give you a red herring, too. Let's look at 2.3 fallacies of weak induction. So this is still informal fallacies, but we're kind of moving more into the induction side of things. So weak induction, the connection between the premises and conclusion is not strong enough. The evidence is inadequate or considered inadequate to support the conclusion. Maybe it's just a shred of evidence, but it's not a preponderance by any means. There's doubt. There's still significant doubt in weak induction. Unqualified authority, or an appeal to unqualified authority. That's where we're basically citing somebody who isn't necessarily the best person or the best judge of a policy or another person. So this is one I would consider. Warren Buffett is one of the most successful investors in the world. True. Buffett criticizes accounting rules for being unreadable. True. Therefore, the BASB should improve the readability of accounting rules. Well, hold on a second here. I respect Warren Buffett. He's definitely a person who's seen his fair share of financial statements and read through them, but I wouldn't necessarily consider him somebody who practices accounting. So a person who practices accounting on a regular basis, I would probably go to them and get their opinion about how the readability can be improved, if at all. But that's one where you can look at that and say, but he's a business guy. He should know this stuff. Well, maybe he does. But are there potentially other people out there who are worth citing? Like, say, the SEC chairman, right? appeal to ignorance. This is a jump to conclusion. Jump to conclusion map from Office Space. Never mind. Jumps to the conclusion given a lack of evidence to support the conclusion. So this is one where it's just like, okay, somebody just, when you say appeal to ignorance, it's almost kind of like they're being lazy. That's how I sort of look at appeal to ignorance. So the police went to investigate a reported burglary. The police saw Beerbo walking away from the scene. Because the police saw no one else, they arrested Beerbo. You're under arrest. It could just be that, hey, he's just there, walking down the street, minding his own business, and there happens to be a burglar nearby. But you owe it to do your investigation to find out, hey, is this really the guy or not? Okay, that's why I sort of like appeal of ignorance. It's basically saying, I've got nothing. I've got this, like, it's the same the guy, the aliens guy, right? It's all about the ancient aliens saying, like, well, there was no such technology, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. So there must have been aliens that did all these crazy things back then. It's like, well, there's no proof. You don't have any evidence, so you're kind of resorting to this. It must be aliens. That's probably an even better explanation here. Appeal to ignorance is like saying must be aliens. So think about it that way. Informal fallacies that are hasty generalizations. This is really something that accounting researchers, anybody who's a PhD who does research on a regular basis has to deal with this kind of stuff, where there's the sample size is messed up somehow. You can't make a generalization from a bad sample. So the conclusion is based on an adequate sample. The sample is perhaps too small, or maybe it's not chosen randomly. So think about it like this. Approximately 55% of TTU undergraduates are white. Thus, the state of Texas is approximately 55% white. Well, universities have their own sort of diversity that relative to their local or state or federal jurisdiction. So it's kind of difficult to say, oh, Texas Tech University undergraduates is representative of the population of Texas. That's where we can come into trouble with that one. Here's one of my favorite ones. Budweiser, Miller, and Coors are disgusting and make me sick. Yeah, well, those are brands of beer that some people tend to turn people off of beer. Thus, all beers are disgusting and will make me sick. If you have any questions about that, by all means, ask me, because I don't want people thinking that Budweiser, Miller, and Coors represent all the different types of beer out there, though they represent about 90+% of the beer that's out there. False cause. This is where you get a false cause effect situation. Correlation does not equal causation. You may have heard that before. So I remember even in my PhD program, having somebody in my econometrics, professor in my econometrics class showed that there is a correlation between GDP growth and sunspots. And so GDP growth is positively related to sunspots. So we need to instigate more sunspots to boost our economy. Well, that sounds bad. We shouldn't be doing that. Just because you see a correlation doesn't mean causation, right? So it really kind of comes down to saying, how does a sunspot translate to the markets step by step? I think you're missing a few points there. But that's the whole idea behind the evidence. In this case, it's weak induction. Weak induction is basically saying the evidence is not strong enough. So just in the case where you have a correlation, some people stop there. So you can't stop there. There's got to be more discussion about the reason why there is an association, if at all. The slippery slope. This is one that I come across a lot as a professor. The conclusion is based upon an unlikely chain of events. So if I don't get an A on this exam, I won't pass a class. If I don't pass a class, then my GPA will suffer. If my GPA suffers, I won't get an internship. If I don't get an internship, I won't get a job. If I don't get a job, I'll have to move home with my parents. All that's just a slippery slope. You're kind of going down this path of, yeah, might happen, but let's not get hysterical about that stuff. 14, the weak analogy. This is basically a poor comparison between two separate situations, right? If I want to be president, I need to learn how to be a good liar, cheater, and thief. Well, that's a bit harsh to say that. But, a lot of people have distrust about politicians, and that doesn't mean that they represent what it means to be a politician or a good politician. Or here's another one, too. Apple Inc. Imagine if we're Apple Inc. and someone comes up with this idea, hey, we should make a video game console to compete with Microsoft. Apple did have a console. They tried to compete with the Xbox prior to the Xbox launch, but Apple could see that Hey, there's a market for video game consoles. It's kind of a funny story. It's a little bit embarrassing, I'm sure, to Apple, but Apple did try to make a video game console. Why? Because their competitor made one. So oftentimes you see that, oh, our competitor has this disclosure policy. We should adopt it. Well, just because they're doing it doesn't necessarily mean that we should be doing it. And yes, they may be a competitor in the same industry, but maybe they have, maybe there's a reason in the codification or the rules that says we should use something else. Okay, that's the idea behind all these different fallacies. And again, keep this in mind as you go through this stuff. Is that the point of going through each of these different types of fallacies is to think about ways in which the argument could be made more clear. Okay, you don't. It's easy to sort of say, "Oh, that's BS. That argument's invalid, or that argument's unsound," right? But in your writing, you have to be willing to identify potential areas of improvement, or maybe you're making an invalid or unsound argument. And if that's the case, you got to figure out how to make it better, right? So these are the things to watch out for. Is again, this is all about critical thinking. So if you have any questions, let me know.